And now we're going to go to the next phase, which is when a lot of organizations started evolving after SynBERC and even during the last years of SynBERC, testing some of the new and interesting ideas that were coming out of that work and forming new nonprofits and different ways of working in the world and learning about science. So we have BioFabricate and GenSpace and BioDesign Challenge and GP Wright in the Center of Excellence for Engineering Biology and Biotech Without Borders. And some of these I helped the founders to launch, so I was really excited about them, and I'm still involved with a few of those projects. So Jess would love to invite Suzanne Lee and Beth Tuck and Dan Grushkin, Andrew Hessel and Ellen Jorgensen to come up. Well, I guess Andrew actually is in San Francisco. He couldn't join us, so we have a video from him today. Yeah, go ahead. That's good. Okay, so why don't you go down the line and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your organization, what you're doing.
Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Tuck. I'm the executive director of GenSpace. We are a community science lab here in Brooklyn. We're actually just 3 blocks away, so after the party, if anybody wants to stop by, hit me up. I am a molecular biologist by training. I did my research in ALS genetics and really found when I was doing my research that there were so many persistent barriers for people to get excited about, get engaged with, and get to do STEM in really authentic ways that embrace their identities and their communities. And so that kind of led me down the path of getting excited about community bio. And when I learned about GenSpace and other organizations like it, I got really, really jazzed. So it's a true passion for me to get to do this work. So for anybody who's new to GenSpace, we're a community science lab. That means we're an open access science space. We have a whole bunch of different programming types, models, and communities that we serve in our lab, all really addressing the same 2 major persistent issues around access. We recognize that space access is a huge barrier for a lot of people to get interested and excited about science. And then the other issue of access is around people, is around mentorship, collaborators, other people that can kind of help them steer their path along this journey. So GenSpace provides a couple of different programming models that can address those access issues. I'm happy to do a little bit more, but maybe we can save some of that for
Sure.
next.
Yeah. Ellen?
My name is Ellen Jorgensen. I've spent my entire career in molecular biology in New York City. I started it when this was a complete wasteland in terms of any sort of biotech companies or anything else. And I'm one of the co-founders of GenSpace and the founder of Biotech Without Borders, and also a co-founder of a biotech company that's taking over most of the 3rd floor in the building that's next to us, called Annika Biosciences. And my community lab is similar to the original GenSpace, except we're going for a little bit more of a hackerspace model. The original GenSpace model was modeled more on hackerspaces, successful hackerspaces in the electronic space, like New York City Resistor. And so we're doing a little bit more of a member-led and member-supported model. But essentially, it's the same thing that we're trying to address, which is the lack of space for what I would call proof of concept experiments, especially if you're not already embedded in an academic institution. So someone who is a postdoc and whose laboratory invents something and then starts a biotech company, they have a very clear path. It's harder if you are someone like my co-founder at Annika Biosciences, who was connected with me through taking a class at GenSpace. He had an idea, but he wasn't a scientist, so he needed a scientist to partner with, and neither of us had access to a lab, and so we had to build one. And we actually did some of our early experiments at Biotech Without Borders before we moved out. So I think partly because Built with Bio is connected to the whole idea of real estate and everything in New York, I just want to double down on that idea that what Ava Kramer once called a pre-incubator space is something that has a lot of value and should be supported by the city, I think. I think Beth would agree with me. And my space is in Queens, and hers is in Brooklyn. So we're covering the boroughs one by one.
Great, Suzanne?
Hi, I'm Suzanne Lee, the founder and CEO of an organization called Biofabricate. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from New York. I came here 10 years ago, and I came because I was headhunted by a biotech company, Modern Meadow. I'm not a scientist, I'm a fashion designer by training. But I've always been super interested in how science and technology could actually reshape my industry. So I'm a bit of a kind of sci-fi fan, a bit of a nerd, and so I spent 10 years in London going to synthetic biology conferences, and really kind of through having conversations with biologists, realizing that there is a sustainable future when industries like fashion embrace biotech. So for me, there was a kind of turning point in the early 2000s where I realized the future of fashion will be grown, and in order to shape that, designers need to be brought into the process. We need to engage cross-disciplinary, and bring all of these different skill sets together. So I came to New York in 2013, 14, to join Modern Meadow, which is a company that was really kind of started here, is now in New Jersey, and that was a company that was dedicated to growing meat and leather without animals. But at the same time, because I'd spent this 10 years of frustration being the only creative in a room that was trying to talk about this amazing science, most of which went over my head, but I knew that the brains in that room were going to be shaping the world of tomorrow. And I was like, as a designer, this is the most inspiring place to be, and we need to bring more of these kind of interactions together. So when I moved to New York, I said to my CEO at the time, I've started this organization called Biofabricate, and it's to convene this world that is not connected right now. There are a lot of creatives out there who, if they had exposure to more of synthetic biology and biotechnology, would be reimagining the products of tomorrow. And so that's how the first meeting came about. And there are many people here who were at that first meeting, and it was do we have the slide?
Yes, right here.
Okay. Yeah, so that meeting was a big gamble. We were very lucky in that I met an entrepreneur in residence at Microsoft, and she gave me the headquarters of Microsoft for free. And she was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Microsoft doesn't understand synthetic biology. And we even had to go inside Microsoft and dig out researchers that were in their labs who were looking at SynBio. But the HQ in New York, they didn't know anything about it. So there was a big convening of people that had never really been brought together in one room before. And I think everyone was kind of like, what is this?
Yeah.
Like, who are you? And like, why are you here? But no one wanted to leave. Like, at the end of the day, we were trying to kick them out of the building, and the conversations just kept going on. So my thought was that's a one-off meeting, and it's an experiment. And then here we are almost 10 years later, and we're still doing it. And so I think it's that fundamental belief that we need to have this cognitive diversity if we're going to really kind of power biotech in new ways. And New York has it. New York's got the best design schools, the best art schools, the best science, but we need to find better ways of bringing that together. And so many of the companies that have been founded here, actually, we're seeing more and more creatives found companies, but they're founding biotech. So this is really important. I think it's like really understanding that this is way outside of pharma. This is, very much a new kind of vision. This is the future of manufacturing, everything, food, clothes, architecture. It's all going to happen through biotech, and we need to be much smarter about how we facilitate that and fund it. So yeah, I'm an absolute champion for how do we make this happen.
Yeah,
and
so
New York is not Boston. Like, we have things that Boston does not have. And the same with the Bay Area, you know.
Absolutely. So you're going to hear about some of those schools that were flying under the radar today and actually started labs after Dan got a hold of them.
Can I just say,
with
Nancy, I just saw that.
Yeah.
I forgot that slide. So that's 2022, Biofabricate. And so many of those people that you saw in the 2014 one are still here, founded companies, and we have billion-dollar exits out of those founders who we brought together in 2014. So that's the kind of trajectory in the last 9 years.
Well said.
Yeah, it's amazing. So Dan, you and I have been working together for a while, and
Just a bit, yeah.
Yeah. So talk about Biodesign Challenge and where it came from and where it is now.
So, you know, I'm not a scientist. My first job out of college was as a journalist in the Middle East. I was covering Jerusalem when suicide bombings were going off and the peace process was falling apart. I eventually came back to New York, where I'm originally from, and wanted to keep writing, wanted to keep being a journalist, but found myself falling in love with biology. And Megan is in the back. I owe some of that debt to her. I fell in love with iGEM first. And, you know, as a journalist late at night, I was watching iGEM videos.
Can you say what iGEM was?
Sure. So iGEM is the International Genetically Engineered Machines Competition, which is a student competition where students develop synthetic biology projects and meet every year, first in Boston, now in Paris. And I was looking at these amazing creative projects coming from science students, and I thought, as an adult, I wanted to be able to do the same thing. But of course, I didn't have access to a biology lab. I didn't have access to the tools of synthetic biology. And when I looked at what was out there for someone like me, it meant probably another 10 years of going back to school, just to try. And so way back when, 2008, 2009, I met Ellen and a group of other founders of GenSpace, and we started to meet in my living room, and Ellen would bring all of her equipment, and we would bring pizza, and we would just...
Beer, lots of beer.
Beer, and, right. But first the experiments, then the beer, just to be clear. And so that was really my first introduction into the world of molecular biology, synthetic biology. And it just sort of became my job after my job. So during the day I was a journalist, and at night we were meeting in my apartment in Park Slope, and then eventually we went to 33 Flatbush. It very quickly became clear that the experiment that we were doing wasn't just the pipetting, it wasn't just in the Petri dish. It was a large social experiment that I think we're only now beginning to see the fruits of. Mm-hmm. And so when we started GenSpace, we were alone. There was a DIY movement, DIY bio, do-it-yourself biology movement, which was some folks who literally had little labs in their closets, and we created the first community biology lab. And that sort of set a model for labs around the world. So last I checked, there are over 100 of these little institutions for people who are excited about biotechnology but aren't going through the traditional path. And so it's been a real honor and a privilege to work with both of these fantastic women and, well, everyone on stage, really. Wow. So, you know, I think one of the lessons I learned at GenSpace was that when you got a group of multidisciplinary people together, artists, designers, scientists, entrepreneurs, the ideas that they were generating were really, really exciting. They were different from what I would see as a journalist in my day job when it was just a group of scientists working together, or a group of designers working together, or a group of artists. And in those early days, those groups weren't really talking to each other. And so the ideas, in some ways, were very redundant, almost rote. It was pretty lame for a journalist. I was writing about Amherst. I know we spoke about Amherst in the last session. Sort of wrote a takedown piece of them accidentally for Fast Company. Oops, sorry guys. But eventually what happened was we started a program called Biodesign Challenge. And it was really a way to get all of these people from different disciplines together to actually collaborate. And rather than focus on people who are later in their careers or really in their careers, it made better sense for us to focus on students. Because students in a lot of ways are much more, I don't know what the word is, but more experimental maybe is the right word. They're inchoate in a lot of ways. And so we thought if we bring them together early, those types of collaborations will just become the norm for them. So Biodesign Challenge now is in 20 countries, but when we first started, we were working with 9 different institutions, 9 different colleges. We were matchmaking each one of the classrooms of students with subject matter experts, including Suzanne. We actually launched the first year of Biodesign Challenge at BioFabricate year 2. Which was an unforgettable experience. So now at this point, it's in 50 plus universities in 20 plus countries. Every year these students are collaborating across disciplinary boundaries. Their instructors are working across disciplinary boundaries. We're mixing those instructors. A lot of them are artists and designers with biotechnologists and biologists and synthetic biologists. And the ideas that are coming out of these student projects under their mentorship has been absolutely transformative. So I think later today, you're going to meet some of these students. But we've seen a number of companies come out of it, gallery shows or exhibits in multiple countries, museum pieces at the MIT Museum and all over the world. And I think what I can say about it, having now done that project for 8 years, is that a sort of momentum has been created. And that momentum, I think, is going to surpass anything that's happening necessarily in our individual program or even in our individual labs.
Yeah, and initially, I mean, your first competition was at MoMA. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was, Nancy, you were a judge. Suzanne was a judge. Ellen was a judge. I think you're seeing a theme here. It was 9 colleges. It was a total experiment. FIT ended up being the winner of that year's program. So later you'll hear from Aaron. He was one of on that winning team. It was a group of students with very little biology background, a lot of fashion experience, kind of sick of seeing what was going on in the fashion industry with the materials they were using. And they wanted to go into fashion, but they didn't want to pollute the planet. They didn't want to contribute to all the waste that we create in the world. And so their project was an algae project. And they created this little swatch of material from algae, and I forget now. It was an algae-like material. It was basically a slime project, essentially, that had dried into what looked like a piece of ramen. And that was their earliest iteration, and it was incredible. We didn't even think anyone was going to actually get into the lab and make anything at all for the program. They were the first to do it. They ended up winning with their project called Alginate, now Kiel Labs. And they went on to raise $13+ million to turn that idea into a company. Mm-hmm. And year after year with Biodesign Challenge, we've seen that happen identically with other companies, many of them making fashion materials. And I think it's in some sense, tribute to the people on this stage that they've been able to do that work, and that there's a receptive audience out there for what it is that they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that after the realization that their students were really driving this kind of innovation, Fashion Institute of Technology actually built their own labs, right, for their students to use. And I think you're going to hear from some of the other institutions that similarly had epiphanies about the student-driven part of this scientific revolution and how it's transforming their own curriculum. So that's very, very exciting. I want to introduce another one of my colleagues, Andrew Hessel, all of our colleagues, actually. He's in San Francisco today, but he has been, he's very controversial. He's always proposing very controversial projects. And the next one that he's going to talk about, which is GP Wright, was one of them. So he's going to tell us about how we started that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Hessel. I'm a cell biologist and geneticist, and today I work largely in the area of synthetic biology, which is a suite of technologies that make biology easier to engineer. In a previous life, I worked with the Human Genome Project. This is probably the best known scientific project in the world. It's been the largest one, about $3 billion invested over 13 years that it was in operation, and it brought together thousands of scientists. But after the Genome Project ended, that collective energy largely fractured into many different fields of life science, collectively the omics. And about a decade later, I wrote this article for Huffington Post asking whether it was time for another Human Genome Project, this time about writing genomes, because the field of synthetic biology was really starting to get some traction, and yet no one seemed to know about it. A few years later, I was invited to the home of Paul Stamets. He's an incredible champion of mycology, and he had just completed the first year of being an invention ambassador. It was a new program put together by AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Lemelson Foundation to kind of kickstart U.S. invention and innovation, particularly with students. It was a great program. Paul said, "Andrew, you would love this," and he nominated me for the second cohort, which I became part of in the summer of 2015. Part of our orientation was visiting the White House. I was really energized, and right after the orientation, I traveled to New York and was at a meeting in New York organized by Nancy Kelly that brought together scientists that were synthesizing the yeast genome to provide updates. This was really the most important work being done in synthetic genomics, but I realized no one knew about what was going on. Even most scientists didn't appreciate what was happening here. So it just catalyzed in me this idea that it was time to really go for another Human Genome Project, this time writing the human genome. So I called Dr. George Church, and after about a 45-minute conversation with him, he agreed to be a leader of the project with one condition. Dr. Jeff Buca, who was leading the yeast engineering work, would have to join as well. Nancy Kelly continued to have conversations with Dr. Buca over the next few months, and by the end of the summer, he agreed to come on board. And by the fall, we had organized the first meeting of people interested in synthesizing the human genome at NYU. It was a very successful meeting. The energy was terrific. Everyone was very supportive of the idea, and the project and the Center of Excellence for Engineering Biology was launched the following summer, with Ground Zero being in New York City. I still believe that whole genome synthesis is going to be completely transformative to cell engineering. We won't be starting with the human genome, of course, that's too large, but I can already see the possibility now of making microbial genomes quickly and inexpensively, which is going to be the biggest change in microbiology pretty much ever. And moving forward, it's terrific that New York City is really at the epicenter of this bioengineering work, not just in cultivating entrepreneurs, having labs and incubators and other spaces really starting to work on this effort, but more and more also being really central to financing these efforts and moving them forward. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope the meeting is a success and the rest of the panel is exciting, and I truly hope to be with you next time in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so this was kind of the early fermentation of a lot of what happened, and just want to take some questions from the audience about all of this. I think a lot of you are hearing about this for the first time.
I'd also like to make a comment, because it's not just bringing people together, it's bringing organizations together, and everything is so interconnected. That is the strength of what's going on now. I mean, I used to joke, GenSpace, you know, a scientist, a journalist, an artist, and 2 students walk into a bar kind of thing. But that's literally what happened, is we all walked into a situation. None of us knew anything about starting a nonprofit or anything, but we knew that this was a platform, as Dan used to put it. It's like sort of the Swiss Army knife of labs. And actually, the thing that supported us in the beginning was the art students, because they were all doing their master's degree bioart projects in the lab. And it took a while before there was enough publicity around it, which Dan had a lot to do with, of course, and awareness, so that we started getting people that were actually trying to start companies or do proof of concept experiments. And as Nancy said, we hosted the original Opentrons. I got a picture of Will at Maker Faire with his original kind of wired together with chicken wire robot, you know, that became this unicorn company. Curico did experiments in our lab. Beagle Bio, at Biotech Without Borders.
So say what those are, Curico.
Yeah.
Can you say what Curico does?
They have natural protein replacements for toxic ingredients in personal care products. And she needed to do some stability studies. And she had been to, I will not name the city incubator, and the price point was so high, but our price point was, and at Biotech Without Borders still is, $100 a month for access to lab space, basically unlimited access to a fully functional lab. And so sometimes an innovator just needs that one little thing that's very hard to get. And we all kind of came together in this moment of kind of outrage over why New York was not a biotech hub, I would say. And it involved the creatives, but it also involved people like you pulling that New York Genome Center together with a bunch of academic institutions that normally fight like cats and dogs, for example. And so I think there's something about New York City where you can put all these things together. And now we're starting also to get the finance based in New York City. I don't like that all the finance is coming out of the West Coast. It ought to be here too. But part of that is nurturing all the different parts of the ecosystem and making sure they have access to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody have any questions for our panelists? Yes.
Two questions. First one, Suzanne, you mentioned that New York has things that Boston and the Bay Area don't. I'd love to hear you expand on that. And the second is, are there any industries other than fashion that you have seen synthetic biology penetrate into in New York?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Sorry, remind me, what was the first part? I got the second part.
You said New York has things that Boston
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's that cognitive diversity, right? Boston is very much science-based, but it doesn't have the sort of design, marketing, product development scene that we have here. Like, New York is such a center of fashion, beauty, architecture, think about the sort of big product opportunities that are outside of pharma and biomedical, you come to New York for those ideas, right? So having that together with the toolkit of biotechnology or that brain power, mash that together and you have something truly unique. It just is a very different ecosystem to Boston, and I fundamentally believe we shouldn't be trying to emulate what Boston does. New York needs to develop its own identity in this field and really kind of play to our strengths. What is it that we have that Boston doesn't? And the other part around industries is like it's through everything. Everything you touch, everything we think about in our material world, from food to mobility to, architecture. We could grow this entire space today with materials using biotechnology. I mean, and
Well, Annika Biosciences,
Annika,
which is
exactly.
taking over a huge space in Industry City. I mean, we have microbes that are engineered that we use to track and trace things through food products. So the origin of the food that you eat, or where it goes through the supply chain and can be verified by basically a barcode that is invisible, edible. That's a synthetic biology use that is in that sphere of non-medical. And there's all sorts of companies doing it to produce materials. C16 is an enormously successful company that's going to produce things like palm oil, the production of which by natural means is horrible for the environment. Think of anything that you can make through chemicals or petroleum-based, and think of that being replaced with something that's like brewing beer.
I'll chime in too and add that GenSpace, as you all have mentioned, has supported entrepreneurs and startups. We've had 2 companies come out of us recently that have both been in the bioremediation space, so engineering microbes to clean up environmental contaminants. So it's another field that I think is starting to grow here in New York.
Yeah, and a lot of the art institutions did some early work in this field, and I think they were New York-driven institutions like MoMA, who has had exhibitions on biological-based materials and actually built a structure,
And
right?
Suzanne Anker, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't forget her
SVA.
biolab.
Yeah, SVA as well. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting agriculture projects going on that have come out of this community as well, beyond what we've already described. For example, there's a company called Olumbria, which came out of the Biodesign Challenge, where the students were looking for alternative means of pollinating our orchards. And they found that bees weren't the only pollinators out there, and they've found a way to harness other types of insects in the natural environment to draw them to an orchard and literally drive those insects around the orchard and pollinate each of the trees. That's already in field trials in strawberry patches in California and I think the UK. So it's really not just fashion. It really spans everything that we touch and eat.
Yes.
So, just one comment. I love the idea that New York is going to make its own impact on the world, right? We don't have to consider Boston or San Diego or San Francisco. So I think the challenge for all of us in this room is how to come up with that 3-minute elevator pitch, or less, right? 3 minutes or less, to engage people, to understand what is new, different, expanding, and amazing about the New York City mush of science, technology, engineering, fashion. Like, it's so many things, and I do agree with you that New York is making that happen, and it's how to get the entire world to understand, if you're interested in that, this is the place to tap. I don't think people know that yet. In general, like probably in your worlds, each one of your little worlds, yes, but in general, I don't think people know that yet.
Well, one of my first attempts to try to bring that to the world's attention is this meeting. We have never focused on this technology with an all-day meeting, and I would love to make this a track for Builds Bio because it get lost when we have just one panel on this in the symposium in November. But the truth is that this is going to be a bigger part of the industry probably than even the therapeutics and diagnostics areas are. And so we need to start focusing on it. We need to let the world know that it's here. We need to showcase where it's growing, you know, in all of the accelerators and nodes around Brooklyn and elsewhere. Jersey City and, you know, in New Jersey is also helping to grow this field. So this was my attempt, and we have a lower turnout than we usually have for our events, but this is really important. So I'm really glad you're all here to understand why it's so important.
Can I chime in here too?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to emphasize how important it is also to grow the talent pipeline here in New York, right? Yes, thank you. And so we think a lot about who is represented in these fields, who is joining these companies, who is starting these companies, who's founding these companies, what are the identities and experiences that students are coming into these fields bringing, and so that's a big part of where GenSpace has kind of moved over the past 5 years, has really been focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, broadening participation, and how can we really make sure that New York's biotech industry reflects our citizens, our community members. So that's something that I just wanted to encourage folks to noodle on and think about talent pipelines.
You had a comment.
Before you do, I just,
That lady's
go
been
ahead.
trying to speak.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah.
I know you talk about competition in college students, but bringing this maybe down to the high school level.
Yep. That's exactly what we do. Yeah.
So,
We work with things like the DNA Learning Center at that high school, the Urban Barcode Project. I just finished mentoring some students in that. I'm sure you do too. We take interns from LifeSci New York, which focuses mainly on the city colleges. So we do, you know, we do our best to, but I tell you, you know, I was a kid in New York who had no connections. My parents were artists looking for an internship in a lab. And it's tough, and it's just as tough today. So the more spaces that provide that opportunity, the better.
But I think that's an important one, right? It's like, and Nancy, you know, like I'm sure your community is like figuring out how can you support this community in an economically viable way. Like building labs in New York is not cheap, and these kinds of businesses cannot pay pharma prices. So how can we reimagine this, you know, nurturing community, retain it here, but in a way that is going to work for this industry? And maybe that is a coalition of all kinds of different actors. I know, you know, like New Lab are thinking about the Center for Planetary Health, you know, talking to the city and the state about how can we, like it's so expensive to build labs, and like the operational running of that until we've got revenue coming through is a massive lift. We need that support coming from the city more. But I think like figuring out this ecosystem and how to make that financially viable, you know, in a different way to pharma is the big challenge, right?
Yeah, I mean,
where's the money coming from?
In 2017, I submitted the first proposal to the city around engineering biology, and it was for a pilot manufacturing facility here. And it was supported by over 100 scientists from around the world saying they would come to New York and do their work if we had a pilot manufacturing facility. It's taken them 5 years, but with the Center for Interplanetary Health, is that the name of it?
Planetary. I don't think it's
Interplanetary.
we're not interplanetary yet.
not yet, yeah.
I mean, there's a few dreamers that are, but
And they have a new RFP out now for biomaterials lab. They're starting to put money into this, so we're seeing some of that support. Dan?
Yeah, just going back to the question about integrating New York City's youth into our programming, I think we all do it. in 2019, Biodesign Challenge started the experiment. We weren't sure how teenagers or how high schoolers would do basically presenting alongside of college students. 2019, we tried it. They won runner-up and basically won the heart of every one of the judges and the entire audience. And since then, we've really been growing that program, specifically in New York City, and integrating New York City high schools into the programming. And so what we have is an after-school program where we pay the instructors to basically prepare groups of students to participate in the Biodesign Challenge. And I'll say that the students in these programs, the types of projects that they create are nothing like you see from a college student, because their life experiences are so utterly different. The projects that they are creating respond to what is personal to them and respond to the issues in their community. And so it doesn't look like anything you're seeing in today's biotech community. And I would say, as these young people become tomorrow's entrepreneurs, we're going to see that the products that they make and the technology that they make serves a very different community. And I think that's what we should be really focusing on as we grow our programming.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see some of these students. And by the way, Biodesign Challenge is in June, so I encourage you to sign up if you want to see some of these projects. It's being held at MoMA again this year. But some of these students from underserved communities in Central America and South America, you know, they're creating devices that take heavy metals out of drinking water, so, you know, so their family has access to being able to wash their clothes and, you know, just live a normal life. It just, the things that they're thinking about are not what we think about in our everyday lives. And so it's really fascinating to see these projects coming out.
I'll give you an example. In 2019, the winners were from Bogota in Colombia. They created a bacterially charged, maybe is the right word, refrigeration system. So the bacteria basically cool the refrigeration unit. And the idea was that you would be able to carry vaccines back into areas of the Amazon where electricity just isn't found. So it's basically a way to bring modern day medicine to places that don't have the modern day infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it's those types of projects that I see, oh my gosh, this is a great humanitarian use. But you can imagine it in replacing all of the, you know, a lot of the things that we already have today. So the applications are really endless. And I love to see projects like that. And it's coming from people who you wouldn't expect to see. It's coming from people whose problems are different from those of us on stage.
Right. Any last comments? Well, thank you so much. I mean, you've been hearing from the pioneers in this industry, and this afternoon you're going to hear about the companies that have graduated out of these programs and are based in New York and are actually making products now and gearing up for manufacturing and for partnerships with big global commercial players, and their labs are here. So they're going to tell you about what they're doing. And now we've got a great lunch outside under the canopy, so enjoy. Thanks, everybody.